Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Fall Winter series that we are kicking off today for the virtual environmental ergonomics sessions. We hope you've had a great break and that some of you are returning to some sense of normality. I know for us at Brock University, I've just managed to get my first research project restarted this week. So it's been a very long 8 months for us. So to start off this week, first I want to welcome you all again. And on behalf of my co-organizers, Chris Tyler from Roehampton in the UK, and also Tadej Debovic from Ljubljana in Slovenia. And we had a great time organizing the first series. And just to show the, just to show the comprehensive level of speakers that we've had, I just did a count and we had 27 speakers over 12 sessions from April to July, and they are all available for viewing at ICEE2021.com. That is also obviously where you registered. And if you hit on the past talks, you will get to all of the previous talks, along with student guides. If any of your instructors who want to use any of the material for your classes, I know I've been using them for both my undergraduate classes and also for my graduate classes. Saves me from doing a lot of lecturing. So they've been wonderful in that respect. So that's our ulterior motive for organizing these. So we've had a great series so far in earlier this year on everything from firefighter physiology to altitude to extreme cold. And we've also tried to really make it very applied at the kind of really at the practitioner level, in addition to having a lot of good fundamental science. So we'll be trying to continue that with this series. Just to let you know, they'll be going every other week instead of every week. So they'll still be on this Thursday, and the next one will be 2 weeks from now, not in a week. So without further ado, we'll be talking this week about pre-cooling and menthol use. And we have with us two speakers from the UK. The first will be Carolyn Sunderland from Nottingham Trent University, who'll be talking about exercise in the heat and the role of pre-cooling in altering our perception and possibly our performance capacity. And then we'll follow that up with Martin Barwood from Leeds Trinity U, also in UK, who will be talking about the use of menthol. And Martin just led a sports medicine consensus statement on the use of menthol across different applications, from menthol rinses to topical gels, etc. So there'll be a lot of interesting talk about the role of kind of our perception of heat and also how that impacts our performance. So again, without further ado, I will stop sharing screen and I will invite Kaz to share her screen.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Let me. So do you have, okay. Yep, here we go. Perfect. And just before Kaz starts, I will also just finish, please send in your questions to us during the talk using the Q&A tool down at the bottom. And then I will be hosting a short kind of 5 to 10 minute question period with each speaker at the end of each talk, and then along with a panel at the end. So again, thanks very much, Kaz, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Okay, so my talk today is on cooling during exercise in the heat and changing perception. So firstly, I want to thank Stephen and Martin for inviting me to talk today. My outline for my presentation is basically to look at how our perception changes performance. And from these two images, I think one of the key things to explain about this concept is that we've been knowing about perception. It's a behavioral innate trait that we've had over generations, and we've evolved with it. And so it's not the research that's determined this, it's probably behavior that has led the research rather than the other way around, which is quite an interesting concept. So by perceptual cooling, you can obviously use our normal sorts of measures such as thermal sensation, rating of perceived exertion, perceived temperature, thermal comfort, and all those can be used. But we can also use some psychological scales, and psychologists use ones to look at affective state, which basically means your feelings, so how good or bad you feel, and you can see how that might impact upon performance, and also how excited or bored you feel. And again, you can understand why if you're bored or excited, that might affect your ability to perform well, and particularly when we talk about exercise in the heat. So my presentation is going to focus around that and look at the different cooling strategies. The cooling strategies I'm going to present today is neck cooling, and I'm going to present 3 of the studies we've done in our lab. And at this point, I'll thank Chris because he's done most of this work. And then I'm going to move on to studies from around the world that I just chose based off, one, obviously excellent methodologies, also provide good examples, but also fit nicely to contrast with the work we've done in neck cooling. So there's one on ice vests, one on ice slurry, and then I'm going to finish with menthol to try and provide a nice little segue into the talk that Martin will do. So firstly then, our first research area, why neck cooling? Well, as we can see in the images here on the right, obviously this was from the World Athletics Championships last year. Neck cooling has actually now become commonplace in elite sport as well as recreational sport. And because it is commonplace, it's really nice to have used that as a concept. And you can see here, actually, these 2 athletes, I chose them. They're both from the walks and they both won medals. The one took a gold and one took a bronze. Why the neck? Well, again, we come to a perceptual concept. So basically the neck has high allosphysial thermosensitivity. What the word allosphysial means is it means that you have a strong perceptual response, and that results in a change in an innate thing. So in a human, if we talk about high allosphysial thermosensitivity, that means that you are sensitive to temperature. So you look at a temperature change or feel a temperature change, and the response that you would have would be some kind of internal change. So in terms of performance, that could be you would run faster, you feel better, you do more work. So we decided that we would investigate neck cooling as a way to examine how we could change some of the issues that we have with heat and improve performance. So the first study we looked at and investigators was to look at prolonged exercise. And by prolonged exercise, in this case, we meant 90 minutes of exercise. And we completed a three lots of a 90-minute preloaded time trial. The 3 trials were, if I can pick up my pointer, see, yep, okay. So 3 trials here, you can see the collar on the figure. And so one of the trial was a cold collar, one trial was the collar which wasn't cold, and then the 3rd trial was a control trial with no collar at all. And you can see the temperature there, 30 degrees, 50% relative humidity. And the preload was 75 minutes at 60% VO2 max, followed by a 15-minute self-paced time trial. So what did we find? Well, in this case, we measured perceptual measures and thermoregulatory measures. And we also, in all these studies, measured quite a lot of hormones and neurotransmitters. I won't be presenting any of the hormonal neurotransmitter data today, but to focus primarily on the perceptual and the thermoregulatory and the performance. So the performance in this study, if we take a look at the figure, this is the distance covered in the 15 minutes after the preloaded time trial. We have the cold collar, the no collar or control, and the collar which wasn't cold. So in fact, obviously this collar was actually warming up the neck and changing their perception in that way. And you can see here that the cold collar, they ran significantly further and faster than the no collar and the collar. And actually the response was worse in the collar trial. So you actually get this interesting response of if you're warming somebody up around the neck, they do worse. If you're cooling them, they actually do better. So why was that? Well, there was no what you'd call of the thermoregulatory changes, so no changes in core temperature or skin temperature, but there was an improved thermal sensation. So they felt cooler and also they felt that the same work was actually easier. So clearly, in just by cooling, when we cooling a small area of the body when we exercise in the heat, we can change how somebody feels, and then performance is changed in line with those feelings. So following on from prolonged exercise, we move to capacity, again to allow us to look at more the mechanistic aspect of cooling the neck. So in this study, we recruited endurance trained males, and you will see in the later studies, this links quite nicely that we chose 70% VO2 max to exhaustion. This intensity was chosen because we want the primary reason that the participants stop exercising when they're running to exhaustion is related to a hypothermic challenge, that they felt they were under a lot of thermal strain. And so pilot testing allowed us to develop that 70% was about the right intensity for this. They weren't running too long, that perhaps glycogen depletion or motivation, and we come back to the importance of feeling, that boredom wasn't becoming a factor in this particular study. And again, in this one, we made the temperature slightly higher at 32 degrees C, but with similar humidity to the previous study. So in this study, again, because it's a capacity study, we did see some differences in the physiological responses and the thermoregulatory responses. So there was a higher end core temperature because they were running, and a higher heart rate. And at this end exercise point, the RPE and the pleasure were the same. But crucially, as we can see here, the thermal sensation was significantly lower. So again, you can see with the collar that was actually cold in this study, we only did a collar and a no collar, after previously showing that wearing a collar not cold actually made performance worse. We thought it would be better to compare against what you would class as a normal control. And you can see throughout the exercise period, the thermal sensation was lower. And you can see obviously that in the collar trial, performance was improved, and we'll look at that again in the next slide. But the key thing here is that you can see what a big difference it can make in terms of their thermal sensation. And actually, even by the end of exercise, their thermal sensation wasn't quite as high as it was in the trial without a collar. So to look at the performance data, obviously with a capacity test, there is much more variability than we see with the performance. And so within this study, we built in familiarization so we could really look at the reliability and be sure that the collar was the reason for any performance improvement. So if we can just focus on the two familiarization trials here, then you can see the capacity between these, it was 40 minutes, nearly 41, and 38 minutes. And you can see the coefficient of variation here was 8.7%. We then also compared the familiarization with the no collar. Again, obviously the same conditions as we had in the two trials. And this time around, the reliability had come down a little to 8%. And then if we look at the final between the no collar and the cold collar, then you can see we saw a change of 13.5% in performance. So the key findings from this study relate to the fact that the participants' thermal sensation was improved, they felt cooler, but they felt cooler, they ran further by quite a reasonable amount in such a short amount of time, but at the end point, their perceived exertion was exactly the same, and as was their heart rate. So it's quite interesting, and they were able to exercise to a higher end core temperature. And obviously that we'll discuss a little bit later, but they were able to run for longer in the heat and reached a higher core temperature towards the end of exercise. So there was another difference there in the thermoregulatory responses. So we've shown that prolonged exercise in a time trial, we can improve performance. We've shown that we can improve capacity. And so then we went on to look at team sport exercise, which obviously is harder, I guess, to examine in a chamber situation. I know lots of people try to design ways to do this. So for our study, obviously, we're looking at, again, just neck cooling versus no collar. We basically combined motorized treadmill running and sprint treadmill running or non-motorized treadmill running. So how we did this was that we used a motorized treadmill that would mimic the 45 minutes of each half of running. And so they did 90 minutes on the motorized treadmill, two halves of simulated football with a 15-minute gap in the middle for half time. And what we did as our performance measure was we did repeated sprints on the non-motorized treadmill to allow us to measure peak power outputs, mean power outputs, as along with some additional acceleration measures, but our primary focus was mean and peak power output. And so the sprints were completed just after a warm-up before the first half of the simulated football, immediately after the first half, so before the 15-minute rest at half time, and then immediately after the second half of running. And this was done at 33 degrees and 53% relative humidity. So once again, we did all the measures, and the key finding here in terms of our perception was a lower rating of perceived exertion. So once again, even though the motorized treadmill is controlling their work precisely, it actually, the participants felt that with the cold collar, the work was easier, and there was no other physiological differences. So what happened in terms of our performance? Well, on this figure, you can see the power output. This is the mean power output from the repeated sprints. We did 5 6-second sprints with 24 seconds passive recovery. So this is before the first half of football, immediately after the first half of football, and then immediately after the second half of football. And what we found for the mean power output, which is this data, was that there was an improvement in power output across the trial as a whole. Obviously, you can see here that in before exercise, there is literally no difference. And then we start seeing a difference at halftime, and there's a greater difference, and we see some interaction post-hoc effects in the final set. And this figure is very similar to the peak power. So exactly the same for the mean power and the peak power, that performance was improved in terms of the power output that the participants were able to generate, with the only main difference between them being that they perceived it to be easier. So to summarize the neck cooling work, before I go on to show some of other researchers' work, I think the most important thing to summarize is that clearly performance is improved due to improved perception. We saw very few physiological differences in the research we did, and that included hormonal differences and other blood markers. The key aspects are definitely a change in perceived exertion. As you can see for the capacity where they ran to exhaustion, that's the same, which bearing in mind they're running further was quite interesting, and the thermal sensation. One of the other key things I would say from this research, which as a physiologist, I never thought I would say, is I do think it is really worth considering the other perceptual aspects of measurement that we can make. So we measured feeling scale and felt arousal scale, and we found some interesting findings. Sometimes we found that performance, they did feel better, which linked with performance, but sometimes they actually felt worse and yet performance was still better. So I think that can give you some interesting insights to how it is actually affecting a participant beyond what we would class as our classical measures of perceived exertion, thermal sensation, or even thermal comfort. So moving on from neck cooling, I'm going to now talk about other people's research. And as you can see, hopefully from this study, what I've tried to do is choose studies which are very similar to our own, which allows you easily to compare between different cooling methods and the responses that they saw. So this study that was published last year, again, used a simulated team sport match. They actually used 30 minutes of intermittent cycling, 2 halves with a halftime period. During the halftime rest period, the cooling vest that you can see here, which was being developed by Mizuno, was worn by the athletes. 2 by 30 minutes of intermittent cycling gives you some kind of I guess a prediction of performance in several team sports, so which is probably why they chose it. So 30 minutes could be reflective of hockey, which would obviously be played at the Olympics. It's sort of reflective of football, a bit short, maybe a little bit reflective of, again, of rugby sevens, but a little bit long. So I think I'm presuming that's why they came up with using that sort of protocol, that it sort of provides a good example of different sorts of team sports. So what did they find? Well, again, if we start with the perception, like I said, this ice vest was only worn at half time. Following the wearing of the vest at half time, they saw a lower thermal sensation, thermal comfort, and RPE. And with their sprint cycling this time, again, measured power output. And you can see in the 3rd quarter and the 4th quarter, there was a significant improvement in performance wearing the cooling vest. So again, this seems to link nicely with this lowered thermal sensation, lowered thermal comfort, and a decrease in their perceived exertion from wearing an ice vest just at half time. So this study, we're now going to move on to ice slurry, and this is the first study where we've got some kind of ingestion, which, as we know, ice slurry obviously can decrease your core temperature. In this study case, study design, as you will see, that won't be the case of this mechanism. This was purely about looking at perception, as well as changing perhaps responses in the brain in response to the cold receptor, the thermal receptors that are in our gut and in our mouth. So in this study, ice slurry ingestion or L-menthol mouth rinse or a placebo, obviously with no calories and not cold, was used as a mouth rinse. And this was given at 85% of a baseline duration. And this study was cycling at 70% VO2 max to exhaustion. So again, you can compare this with the running study that we did. And so obviously by swilling at 85% or ingesting ice slurry at 85% of their baseline duration, that's only going to have a small effect and obviously is unlikely to have decreased their core temperature, which it didn't. So in terms of the findings of this study, here is our 85% that you can see marked upon the trial. So from their baseline, the 85% value. And following the swilling with either control or mouth or ingesting ice, you can see that performance was improved in the menthol trial versus control, and also in the ice trial versus control. And this was by 6% and 7%. So again, quite similar findings to some of the time trial performance and the results that we've seen before. And the rating of thermal sensation in this study wasn't actually significantly different, but there was a large effect size. And again, this is probably because, as you can see, obviously they've got quite a big data set, but only at this point here have they actually ingested the three different drinks. So the control, the menthol or the ice. So they've actually only got 2 time points where they've actually would expect to see a difference. And actually this was a large effect. So again, you can see that it does suggest that thermal sensation is quite important in terms of what people's behavior is and in terms of the stimuli that these were given to the oral cavity. And the final study, which before moving on to obviously Martin and not taking up all his time, relates to menthol. And this is a really nice study design, which we used a fixed rating of perceived exertion. And there was a lot of control went into this in teaching the participants what RPE felt like, having very specific cutoff. And again, this used L-menthol or mouth rinse. Again, very similar temperatures as we've seen across all the studies, 35 degrees C and 48% relative humidity. Now, in this study, the participants were given either the menthol or the mouth rinse 1.5 minutes prior to starting this fixed RPE of 16 to exhaustion, and then every 10 minutes at regular intervals throughout the exercise period. So what did rinsing with menthol do to performance? Well, again, as we've seen with most of the studies, there was no difference in core or skin temperature, but there was 7% increase in capacity and a 4% increase in power output. So again, the percentage increases seem to be quite similar across quite a few studies in terms of the performance benefits that can be seen. And you can see in the diagram of the mean results, obviously you can see the improvement and you can see the individual data as well there, which, you know, there's the odd person where you can see a different response, but in general, you can see the pattern of the performance improvement. So what happened with perception in this study? Does that fit with what we've been showing? Well, actually, there was no change here in thermal comfort. If we look at the top diagram for our menthol versus placebo, whereas the thermal sensation was significantly lower. And here again, you can see this is where they did the swilling of one of each of the drinks in every 10 minutes. And you can see a definite decrease in thermal sensation. So there seems to be quite a lot of consistency across the research in terms of the findings that we see in terms of thermal sensation or thermal comfort, it basically improving, and that also linking to a change in performance. So my summary message would be that clearly changes in perception are important for performance, and they do lead to behavioral changes in us as individuals. Being able to alleviate perceptual strain often doesn't alleviate actual thermal strain in these situations, but it does improve performance. But the benefit of that performance is dependent upon the level of the thermal strain. The higher the thermal strain the individual is under seems to basically directly correlate with the amount of performance improvement that you can get. So obviously, if core temperature isn't the limiting factor, then clearly cooling is not going to have the same benefit. Acclimation may attenuate some of these perceptual changes. So again, there's some studies that suggest that with acclimation, when participants are more used to and more prepared for exercise in the heat, and they've had a physiological adaptation to exercise in the heat that can improve performance, then perceptual cooling may not be as beneficial as it was before. And I guess my key take-home message, as well as perception being important for performance, is it also you can be dangerous. So if we take these two images on the right, these is from the same World Championships that we saw the nice images at the beginning, where I was saying how great neck cooling was, with the athletes who won medals. These athletes clearly didn't win medals. Okay, so and all these athletes were using neck cooling. So I saw images of these athletes wearing those sorts of things, or pouring ice on their heads before putting these photos in. So I think it's really important that we do consider, if we can in a lab, we would always control and monitor core temperature, but we also need to consider that we educate ourselves and educate athletes about the dangers of using perceptual cooling, particularly during elite performance or in highly motivated situations. Okay, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Carolyn. And I think it raises that last bit you had raises a really important point about the possibility of pushing individuals too far into a state where they're psychologically or perceptually okay, but physiologically not. So I think that's a really critical kind of counterpoint to any of this that we are talking about. So again, while we have the question period, again, please feel free to ask questions within the Q&A tool. And we just have a first one here. Is there a synergistic additive effect between different methods? So whether kind of the neck cooling, the menthol rinsing at the same time, what do we know about kind of adding all of these possibilities together?
Yeah, so there is, I would say, more and more studies coming out on that, and there is evidence that mixed methods do work. There's also some evidence that because of the tests that people use, there's a limit to the benefit you can see, if that makes sense. So if you can take something like ice slurry before, and so you pre-cool, plus then more of a perceptual cooling method, then you can see quite some big benefits. But if you take ice slurry and neck at the same time, then those benefits don't seem to be as great. Does that make sense? So if you can combine a physiological cooling method with a perceptual cooling method, then you can definitely get some combined benefits.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's been a decent amount of work using kind of different mixed methods for pre-cooling, whether it's combination of ice slurries along with kind of toweling, ice towels and ideas like that. But I have another question talking about research suggesting that slurry ingestion is associated with reduced sweating. What do you know about that, and does it mean it can be counterproductive in that case?
Yep, so the research has shown that obviously it causes a heat sink, and so then you get more heat storage, and it can reduce sweating, and that can have a negative potential effect on performance. But so far, most of the studies, I would say, of the ones I've read, have actually shown that hasn't borne out in a lab. To my knowledge, unless somebody knows different, I don't think anybody's properly done it in a field yet to actually see in these more competitive situations if that becomes the limiting factor and does become a negative effect. But so far, nobody's found. The theory is there that it definitely is does reduce sweating, but in terms of performance, it hasn't actually been shown to become negative, to my knowledge.
Great. And we have a question from Ralph Gordon from Chris's lab. Cooling the neck obviously only covers a small surface area, and the efficacy of cooling is proportional to the magnitude of the cooling stimulus. Could you comment on the potential benefits that whole head cooling might have and whether there might be an actual physiological cooling? Kind of at what point does the neck cooling, kind of as you increase the surface area of cooling, become more physiological rather than perceptual?
Yeah, well, I think obviously, I mean, the easy answer to that question is it becomes physiological when you change core temperature. um, Up until that point, it's perceptual. Obviously, if you can measure brain temperature and we could show it was cooling a little bit of the brain in terms of the head, then again, I would say it was physiological. But then I think, and again, obviously, if there's a psychologist, then I don't want to insult them, but I do think if you change somebody's perception, it is a physiological response that is happening in your brain that is changing perception. And when I've spoken to psychologists about this, they've all absolutely agreed with that concept. The perception is a physiological response. Obviously, the head cooling thing, I think, would be a great asset. Obviously, you can't do head cooling like when running in a marathon like you can with a neck. It could be done, but I think a lot of athletes could feel pretty uncomfortable because when you're putting something on your head and running, it's a different concept to putting something around your neck. Again, we come back to basic behavior. That is a behavioral thing. We don't tend to put big things around our heads when we're hot. We put caps on and light things.
Yeah, I guess where that might come into play is if you are at an aid station and pouring kind of
Yeah,
ice water over your head or kind of,
yeah. Or
or putting an ice, yeah.
half time with the ice vest, the same concept. I could see it could be really useful in those aspects of actually building it into an ecological protocol.
Hmm. And I guess one other question that I had was obviously your talk's been geared around sports performance and perception, but there are certainly kind of clinical applications for kind of just changing our perception and ease of exercise for activities of daily living, etc. So I guess I'm thinking at it from a perspective of, say, multiple sclerosis, where we know there is a physiological impairment when people are hot and when MS individuals do get hot. And I know I've done studies showing that pre-cooling with a head cooling device that actually dropped their core temperature has been able to improve their everything from their stand up and go time and 6 minute walk time. Do you think something like just changing the perception might be enough in some of these clinical situations too?
Yeah, no, I do actually. I mean, obviously, there's a huge market out there, which has tapped into that, which I'm without evidence, I feel, when I've looked at some of those products. But the research that I've seen does suggest it is highly beneficial. And same with athletes disabled athletes, and we've done some work with MS athletes as well. And again, we saw some of those. Again, one thing I would say we found was quite individual, depending upon what state of disease they had. And so that is one thing I would definitely say, I mean, for everybody, but I think particularly with clinical populations, I think for the general public, I think definitely, but for the Paralympic population, which we've done some work with, there was definitely a really individual response based upon how, what level of impairment they had.
Great. And so I think with that, that last part really set up things very well for Martin. So we will switch over to Martin and Kaz, if you wouldn't mind kind of during Martin's talk answering some of the Q&A also. And while I have you here, also congratulations on surviving Chris Tyler as a graduate student. It's definitely a feather in your cap or a whether you take that positively or negatively, we'll let you decide. But
It was a joy.
yeah, but Martin, maybe if we can get you to share your screen and begin your talk.
Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. All right. Just first to say thanks very much to Stephen, Chris, and today for the invite to talk, and also for Caroline for appearing alongside me in this section. Virtual ICEE is a fantastic new initiative that keeps ICEE in our conscience between conferences. So it's a real pleasure to appear and be able to talk as part of this medium. I am going to do a shameless plug for our main conference at the end of this talk as well. I'm the chair of the organising committee for ICEE. And I can't speak highly enough of the community and the people that are involved with that organisation. So, and this group of people reflects that. So the talk will focus on perceptual cooling. It's absolutely menthol. I like the idea that we can change perception by sipping mojitos, which is the picture in the slide behind, but actually in the sport performance context, we're talking about some other types of mediums and application routes. So I'll talk about menthol, and I'll try to accentuate the sort of practical considerations and applications to build on what Caroline has talked about. So for those of you who don't know me, just a little bit about my background. I trained at the University of Portsmouth with Prof. Mike Tipton, and that work focused on cold water immersion and exercise performance in the heat. And the area that we're going to spend the time talking about came around just prior to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And we were UK Sports Thermal Physiology Lab. So we were answering environment-related questions for our elite athletes, Team GB, and the sports that were organising their athletes. And we had a question around that time about whether menthol would be, and menthol-based commercially available products would be worth investment for the different kinds of sports prior to Beijing. And it was Jason Gillis who undertook that work, and Jason is frequently cited in this body of literature. I became interested in menthol because it was one viable route to potentially change perception during exercise in the heat. And I was very interested to see whether that would perturb our ability to pace our exercise performance. And that's my background as an endurance exercise performer. So I was very interested in pacing. I joined Northumbria University in the northeast of England between 2012 and 2016, and now I'm based in West Yorkshire at Leeds Trinity University as a reader in physical activity and health. And throughout the time since the Beijing Olympics through to the present day, I've continued to work and look at menthol as a potential intervention, not just in relation to sport performance, but as Stephen really nicely pointed out, there are other applications and we're exploring some of them. So that plant at the top, I can assure you, is menthol, and we've continued to sort of work with that throughout the years. So I'm going to cover some of these points, why menthol in the first instance, and I think I've explained a little bit of how that came about. I'll summarize some of the relevant research and the body of evidence around applying menthol to the skin. I'll also talk about ingestion, and mouth rinsing is included in that definition, but there's ingestion into the gastrointestinal tract as well as mouth rinsing. And Caroline has covered one of the studies relating to mouth rinsing. And then I'll talk about a very recent piece of work that Stephen really kindly mentioned at the start of his introduction around the practical considerations for maybe using an intervention like menthol to change perception during exercise in a hot, humid environment that we would expect in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics or whenever it takes place. We'll talk a bit about the health risks, and they were briefly touched upon in the prior presentation, and then some of the populations that the evidence base is established in and why that could be dangerous to assume that they would be, the same effects would be seen in the elite population. And then the last aspect is legality, because if we establish that menthol is a performance enhancing substance, it's an interesting thought experiment to consider whether it contravenes any of WADA's guidelines around prohibited substances, but we'll cover that later on. So I'm going to start by asking you a personal question. You don't have to respond in the chat function, but did you shower and brush your teeth this morning? For the vast majority of you, the answer would be yes. And it is plausible that one or both of the products you use during your morning routine included some aspect of menthol. And I'm not on commission for any of these products. Other products are available. And the reason we're using those products might well be because they leave us with a feeling of freshness, coolness and comfort. And that really is what this presentation is about, and the role that menthol can play in delivering that sensation through a variety of exercise scenarios. And then a brief history of menthol. This is a product, not a product, rather an organic substance that has been a part of our history for hundreds of years. The primary active ingredient in peppermint oil, and the plant from which it's derived would be spearmint or peppermint. It was first cultivated in England in the 17th century, and it was touted as an indigestion remedy back in Egyptian times. It's listed in the London Pharmacopoeia in the 1700s, so listed as a medical remedy for a selection of ailments, including nausea, morning sickness, and pain. So we've been interested in it for a long time, and it's something that appears in our diet quite frequently. But maybe the great interest in menthol in terms of exercise science and research was re-stimulated early in the 2000s, which identified the specific thermal sensor that is stimulated by menthol. So that is a TRPM8 thermoreceptor. So that receptor is stimulated in a similar way from the chemical stimulation of menthol, in a similar way to temperature change itself. So that's the mechanism by which we're able to change perception, by stimulating that TRPM8 receptor. And wherever that's found within the body, in theory, we can target that. So the next slide sort of summarizes that in terms of where the body locations are. So the anatomical person on the side of the slide there has got the sort of different thermoreceptors identified there. So the oral cavity is one of those places. The central nervous system as well. So that's quite important because there are sites for relay of the afferent information, the sensory information that we may that may change from menthol stimulation of the skin, and how that's relayed into the central nervous system. So there's that really nice transfer between the two, the skin, and then also the gastrointestinal tract. And then the schematic on the other side shows that those are the four main areas where we might find TRPM8 receptors. So those are our sites for stimulation where we might target with menthol to activate that receptor. So what's the relevance to sport? I think that it's well established, and many of the audience will know, that exercise in the heat is deteriorated compared to a normothermic or cool control condition. And part of that early fatigue, part of that impairment to performance is down to perceptions of pain, as you can see from the title at the top of the slide, and perceptions of thermal sensation. So feeling hot and uncomfortable, and that can eventually translate into pain. And we know that that can be limiting. We obviously can't completely offset the normal physiological breaks that we get during exercise in the heat, but perception is a big part of that, and Caroline has done an excellent job in making that case. And we also know that as part of that, pacing regulation, so our ability to recruit our muscles to complete physical activities is down-regulated early on during an exercise bout in a hot environment. So perception would be needed, or is one grounds for offsetting that reduction in motor unit recruitment. And that could be, perception could be manipulated to improve motivation to overcome that. And that's the theoretical concept. So in terms of the performance effects of menthol during exercise in the heat, this is data from a meta-analysis. And for those of you who are not familiar with a meta-analysis, it's a summation of statistical information around a performance intervention or intervention of any kind. And we can see this nicely summarized in relation to mouth rinsing on the top of the slide, and then external application to the skin on the bottom of the slide. And this is from the study of Jeffries and Waldron. And this is the performance effect. And you can see that there's clear, significant evidence that favors menthol in terms of mouth rinsing, which is on the top of the slide. but less substantial evidence in terms of menthol application to the skin. Now, part of the variation between those two could be caused by, for example, different concentrations, different surface areas covered, and also some of the aims of the studies will slightly differ compared to the mouth rinsing studies. So that some of that variation could be down to that, but there's a greater amount of evidence saying that mouth rinsing does enhance exercise performance in the heat compared to external application. In terms of the perceptual effects, you can see that the story is much greater in evidence of application to the skin. And part of it, again, is down to the number of those TRPM8 receptors that are stimulated, potentially by covering the torso with menthol, for example, compared to just stimulating those that are found in the oral cavity. So the strength of evidence is still significant in the context of mouth rinsing, but external application does evoke a greater perceptual benefit. And then the last modality we talked about, so the evidence-based, this is ingestion itself. So this is a study by Best and colleagues, and they've identified all of the ingestion papers. This will, in addition to be manipulating perception, will also be performed in comparison to some kind of physiological cooling. So it's not strictly perception that is being manipulated here. And one of the good questions in this area is, what is a suitable control for a menthol-based intervention? That's something that's been a bit more difficult with to introduce with mouth rinsing studies. But the effect size is still significant, albeit small, in the context of ingestion. So what's our application of this to elite sport? In the context of the Tokyo Olympic Games, I started by talking about the interest in this kind of ergogenic aid prior to the Beijing Olympics. This is probably an area that's been reinvigorated because the environment where the Olympic Games will take place will be hot and humid, whereas Rio, the previous Games, and London Games were probably not ones where there's a significant thermal problem. But these are the different sports that we would expect that are taking place in the Tokyo Olympic Games. And it's interesting to think from a practical perspective whether perception is limiting to all of them. And that was one of the questions that we had prior to the Beijing Games. So in which of these can we meaningfully intervene, and in which of these should we intervene where perception is a problem? And that's been part of the dialogue that we've had with elite sport in the past, where you can provide advice and say, this may not be the primary problem, so no need for intervention in this context, but understanding the individual needs of the sport is of primary importance. So we took this forward in the context of menthol, knowing that there's a good basis for those three different types of menthol-based intervention. I should take the opportunity here to thank my co-authors here for a really significant contribution to this paper. It couldn't have been done without them, and many of the people you can see listed in the authorship at the top are first authors or lead authors in the body of work that I've described in the meta-analyses. So we were looking and speculating, I guess, that the Olympics will take place next year. We're hoping that's the case. This expert-led consensus statement was looking to provide some guidance. So these are the key points that we were looking to cover in relation to performance, perception, and body temperature regulation, how the mouth rinsing or application could affect those things. And really importantly, we were looking to provide guidance on the safe and effective use of menthol for athletes, practitioners, and researchers. So the idea was to try to give guidance on how to maybe implement this in preparation for for Tokyo when it came about. So the schematic that just appeared on your screen there just describes the kind of process that we went through. So we completed a modified Delphi study, and we got a group of experts together, defined by a preset criteria, and we interrogated a group of statements. And maybe before I talk a bit about the process, what was remarkable about this is that we considered the evidence base in relation to all of the different Olympic sports, and there's actually not a great deal of evidence that they may be efficacious in quite a lot of them. So it's interesting that maybe there is good reason to intervene, good reason potentially to consider them in the context of lots of different sports, because the research base is not established, and therefore there's an opportunity maybe to sort of get a performance edge. So, and we had, so we started off with a group of statements that we voted as a group anonymously about whether we supported, whether we agreed with their statement, whether it was true or false. And then if we reached an agreement at 80% threshold level, we retained that statement and wrote it into the consensus statement itself. And we started off with 100 and we started off with 96 statements in relation to application, 96 in relation to mouth rinsing, and we only ended up retaining 62. That's about a third of them. So it gives you an idea of the kind of scale of work and unknowns there are in this area, and that's really exciting. So we went through the 3 different rounds of voting, and we concluded with a face-to-face vote on any contentious statements or caveats that were needed. And we did that at ICEE in 2019 in Amsterdam. So another really meaningful thing that the conference has done for us is bring together that group of experts and complete this piece of work. So we were looking to provide this guidance, this onward guidance. So in addition to aspects of perception and performance, we also sought to describe the population in which the evidence is established, potential health effects, whether it's within the spirit of the sport, and also the levels of evidence, the quality of the evidence underpinning the points that we made. So firstly, in relation to populations, most of the evidence base was established in males. That is an unfortunate characteristic of thermal physiological studies, and it's thankfully something that's being addressed by many researchers in the area. A lot of the time females are not included because of variations in body temperature profile associated with a menstrual cycle. So there's not a great deal of evidence base established in females, and that's something that would need to be addressed in future research. A lot of the work is undertaken in trained persons rather than elite, and I think it's an interesting thought as to whether this intervention is wise in an elite group. So Caroline made a really nice point about what are the risks associated with relieving the perceptual strain in a group of already motivated athletes performing at the very top of their game. And I suppose the other thing, again, touched upon earlier on, is that very little evidence, if any, in Paralympic athletes as well. So there's grounds for intervention in this group as well. So just building on that idea about how relieving that thermal break, the perceptual break that, that we may have to slow down or stop exercise in the heat, what would happen in elite athletes? And this is a model of fatigue suggested by Schlader and colleagues in 2011, and it describes the progression in fatigue. So an anticipatory down regulation in our ability to recruit our muscles to deploy, to generate force. If that continues, premature exhaustion could occur, and then eventually homeostatic failure. And I think it's interesting to speculate where elite athletes are already on that continuum, because they're already excellent at ignoring the signals that you and I would normally take to either slow down or stop. So we do have to be careful, and Caroline was absolutely right that we could end up with heat stroke and health-related problems. So we do need to be careful with that, and that's something that we made as a point within the statement. What about the health risks? So, and this study here I've highlighted is talking about those TRP receptors potentially as signals for organ toxicity, and they make a case for that in this particular paper. So menthol, when consumed in very, very high quantities, is actually lethal. And there have been all sorts of negative health consequences. So we need to be mindful about that when we advise people about using this new intervention. So these are some of the risks, from the extremes of mild irritation. That's something that has been reported by Gillis and colleagues at the outset. Serious eye damage, respiratory irritation, organ failure, and there have been documented cases of death through inhalation and ingestion. But we're really talking about very high concentrations, and a lot of the studies that have been published, I didn't talk about concentration specifically, are really low, fractions of a % when applied to the skin in gel or oil form, or perhaps spray form. And the concentrations for mouth rinsing, again, tend to be at or below 1%. So these are the kinds of guidance we provided. I mean, you can buy crystallized menthol with some safety or person checks, So you can buy a really solid and high concentration lump of menthol that would be lethal. So if you're preparing it from scratch, it would be a case of using safe working practices, well ventilated areas, food standard certified products, following the manufacturer instructions, and perhaps referring to the literature for the doses as well as the concentrations used. And then really importantly, testing this in training. So to ensure that elite athletes, who really are case studies in their own right, respond positively to the intervention, and also that it's not marketed or used in competition as the first test. So again, returning to the issue of spirit of the sport. So those of you will know that anything that should be listed on WADA's prohibited list should achieve 2 of the 3 points that you can see in the middle of your screen. So this was part of our consideration as to whether menthol should be listed. Well, we've already established that it does enhance sports performance in different ways, and the meta-analysis support those ideas. But also, does it represent actual or potential risk to the athletes? And there's some debate around this, because in theory, if you do relieve the perceptual strain, maybe an athlete could be more inclined to injure themselves or have a health-related problem with heat-related illness. But we considered this at length and considered that this one probably wasn't quite yet justifiable. And does it violate the spirit of the sport? Well, menthol is widely available, can be cultivated by anybody, and consequently it's something that appears in our diet frequently. So we did consider this at length and concluded that there was no evidence to put it on the prohibited list. Though we did have a long discussion about this, and we drew on the example of caffeine, which is not on the banned list at low concentrations, but does have a threshold that we should consider, that is considered to be excessive and maybe violates 2 of these 3 criteria. So back to our schematic or icons of the different sports at Tokyo. The evidence base with menthol is probably best established in the 3 sports, broadly speaking, that you can see highlighted on the screen. It's an interesting thought, again, as to whether from a practical perspective, we can intervene in all of these sports. So some of them may, for example, have periods where you're in a call room scenario, a marshalling area, where delivering an intervention may not be feasible. And the time course of menthol intervention application is probably beyond about 20 minutes. So we're looking for a suitable window where we could use that, whereas mouth rinsing is much more transient. And we would need to consider carefully where within the restrictions, practical limitations of these sports, we could reasonably deliver this as an intervention. But I'm aware of circumstances where it is feasible. So these are the points that I've hopefully covered. I know it's been a whistle-stop tour, and hopefully you found it engaging and interesting. And I'll take some questions subsequently. I did mention I was going to do a shameless plug for the next ICEE main meeting. Just to reiterate, it's a world-class scientific program that we put together that is only complemented and reflected in the virtual ICEE. It's a very supportive environment of early career researchers and postgraduate researchers, and it's an opportunity to develop a network and friendships that can last a lifetime. And it is the most magnificent meeting of people, and I really look forward to the next one, which is in theory taking place in Canada. We get to go to some nice places along with that too. So hopefully, COVID permitting, we'll see you in person at the next ICEE, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. And obviously I have a vested interest in that. I am the actual organizer for what was going to be the 2021 event, but we've decided to postpone it, that we really want a physical meeting because of this networking and real kind of interactive nature of the conference. But we are going to postpone it to 2022, and we're kind of working on plans for that right now. Thanks a lot for that talk, Martin. I'm actually going to pass it on to Chris Tyler. He says he has a few questions that he wants to explore with you. So while he does that, I will man the Q&A tool.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Martin. Two quick questions, and you alluded to both of them, but is there a dose response? So you talk about menthol as a single entity. Do we know what percentage, for example, for the gels is most effective? And do you have any good ideas about a placebo or an adequate control when investigating menthol studies?
Yeah, no, good questions. And sorry, I couldn't cover all those sort of different things in depth. So Gillis and colleagues have recently published a paper where they looked at what they described as a low, a medium, and a high concentration menthol. I believe that I'm just trying to recall the concentration for the medium one. I think it was about a 3% menthol gel, there or thereabouts. And they saw a ceiling effect effectively in terms of the perceptual and physiological response that was evoked. That was done at rest. You're absolutely right, it's going to be surface area dependent. The other thing that's worthy of note, and again, I couldn't cover it a lot here, is that we do see sometimes deep body temperature is higher in the menthol condition. And that only fractionally, but so in theory, the menthol application can lead to an increased deep body temperature because it suggests that potentially there's some change in peripheral vasomotor tone. So some constriction of blood vessels that leads to some extra heat storage. Although there are colleagues that show that menthol at higher concentrations in kind of microvascular studies does evoke vasodilatation. So I suppose there's some debate about whether it actually evokes vasoconstriction, but the net result is that that there is a greater amount of measured heat by deep body temperature measurement that is recorded in those studies. So in theory, it could increase heat-related illness, and if you think, or the risk of that, and if you think the perception is improved, then that's not an ideal scenario. But practical examples in the field would need to be kind of used to support that idea, I suppose. And then in relation to your other question about a suitable control, this isn't something that's blighted the application studies so much. This is a problem with the mouth rinsing ones, and they've tended to use a sort of bitter flavor control. There's some discussion about whether that's adequate or not, but in terms of application, we've used a comparable spray, but with none of the menthol present. And Gillis and colleagues have been able to use a controlled gel as well. So there are good, probably better controls in the application. That's not to criticize colleagues doing the mouth rinsing. It's more of a challenge with them, with that scenario.
Great. Chris, I'm going to jump in with a pair of questions here that are somewhat related, both related to the idea of kind of mouth rinsing versus ingestion. So I guess one is, are there additional benefits to ingestion of menthol versus just rinsing? If so, by what mechanism? And then the flip side of that is there increased risk that you've laid out with ingestion versus rinsing by itself?
So in relation to it does become quite difficult with the ingestion when you're talking about ingestion into the gastrointestinal tract, swallowing, I suppose, of the menthol, because they've tended to have studies which have additionally delivered some physiological cooling. So I think that the study that Caroline referred to earlier on didn't show any additive effect of the menthol and the ice slurry together. The mechanism of that, I suppose, is quite interesting, because in studies where we have looked at ingestion of a cold beverage, for example, we've suggested that the thermal signal from the deep body becomes more salient from a perceptual perspective as deep body temperature rises and later in the exercise bout. Whereas if you're relieving that early on, actually the signals from the skin are more salient. So I think some of it is about timing, really, and maybe the optimal pre-cooling or cooling intervention probably would include some combination of application at one point and ingestion at another. I hope that answers your question. I may have answered a completely different one.
I think that gets the heart of it. It's kind of what are the mechanisms, and how important kind of are those gastroreceptors in addition to just the oral receptors from whether it's rinsing or even with hydration. Certainly some of the work I have done on blinded hydration with just rinsing versus others who have used a kind of actual drinking, but in combination with a gastric tube that removes the ingested fluid, shows that there seems to be differences there in those oral, not just the oral receptors, but also the kind of the receptors within the gastric tract itself. Another question here is there a good way for slow release of menthol during a cycling event where mouthwash isn't possible? For example, halfway through a 60-minute time trial, the idea being a lozenge that can be taken easily mid-effort to give the perceptual relief in the last half of the race. So I guess the whole idea of a bolus versus a more phased or gradual release of that menthol effect, and how that might actually work in real life.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I suppose you could embed menthol, within clothing. Is one plausible means of doing that. I don't know that that would necessarily lead to a timed release. A menthol lozenge is one possibility. I think it does become quite potentially restrictive. Back to my practical point earlier on about the different sports, is when can you reasonably intervene with a sports performer. So you might be looking at single application of menthol lasts about 20-ish minutes, and we have looked at reapplication. So if there's grounds for doing that in between, for example, events, if they're suitably short-lived, then there is that opportunity. But slowly release menthol is something that certainly would be interesting. And the lozenge, yeah, I mean, I guess that whether that's very compatible with high intensity exercise or not is up for discussion.
Yeah, I guess related to that, there are kind of sports drinks companies like Science and Sport that have released recently, I guess as part of their Turbos Trainers series of drinks that have menthol in them, with the idea that, especially when cycling indoors where you have a lot more heat buildup, that it's supposed to help relieve some of that discomfort. So that certainly, I guess the thing with cycling is that it's quite amenable to interventions such as menthol rinses or cooling strategies, whereas sports, whether it's running or obviously team sports, may be a lot more challenging. Just to follow up with a couple of other ideas from the sport kind of listing that you had. I noticed you didn't put down tennis or things like beach volleyball, which often takes place in kind of very hot, especially with high radiant heat load environments where there are kind of breaks in there. Was there a reason that wasn't kind of listed as a sport where interventions may be effective, or was that because of you were focusing on topical applications?
I think it's just whether the evidence base is there to support them. So that those are great points. It could well be that those sports, are amenable to this kind of intervention. But I highlighted the ones where the evidence base is probably best established. So that's swimming, endurance events in running, as well as with cycling. So the others, I think it is very specific to the demands, and team sports is an area that certainly is worthy of investigation.
Yeah, I guess that's certainly a kind of, in some senses, it's a general kind of gap in our overall field of environmental physiology, especially with thermal manipulations. They tend to be more focused on endurance events and sports rather than necessarily team sports, although certainly Kaz discussed a few studies looking at team sports. But there's probably, if you look at a survey of research, it's probably a disproportionate amount looking at endurance, especially running and cycling. Obviously, the ease of testing, whether in a lab or in a field, I think that also plays a role in it. Chris, any other further questions from you that you want to answer or explore?
Nope.
Okay, then Martin, I'm going to stop sharing your screen and I'm just going to finish off with a couple of closing remarks. So again, I just want to thank everyone for attending today, and just to plug our upcoming talks. Again, in 2 weeks' time, we have speaking. Today's talk was really a perfect lead up because we're going to be talking about the actual Tokyo 2021 Olympics and the work that has been done by scientists in our field to work with the International Olympic Committee to develop heat mitigation strategies and look at the impact of weather on those. So we have Doug Casa from the US, also along with Yuri Hosokawa from Japan and Sebastian Rassene from Qatar. And Sebastian will be our first two-time presenter since he presented earlier on heat therapy and muscle recovery from injury. So that'll be in 2 weeks' time, on November 19th. The key thing is we're moving it a little bit in terms of time to accommodate Japanese attendees, and especially obviously our speaker Yuri. So rather than the current right now in the Toronto area or Eastern time zone in the North America, the talks normally at 1100 hours, we'll be moving it 2 hours earlier. So adjust your time accordingly. So it'll be 9:00 a.m. in the Eastern side of North America. In Britain, it'll be 2 p.m. and Europe, 3 p.m. And then in Tokyo, Yuri has graciously decided to stay up for us at 11 p.m. And then on December 3rd, we'll have altitude training for team sports with Olivier Girard and Brendan Scott. That one is also going to be a different time again because of the Australian time zone. So we will have those times up, but make sure you register. And again, we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Want to again thank you to Kaz and to Martin for excellent talks, really nicely integrated about the whole role of perception and physiology and performance. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your day and keep safe.